Okay, welcome back. In this video, we'll be talking about sources of data, scales, and variables. And starting with sources of data, this obviously isn't going to be totally comprehensive. We're not going to cover every possible data source out there for social science, but some examples to give context for the types of data we might be analyzing in statistics or in our research in social science. Some of the most common ones we see in things like psychology are questionnaires and surveys. I'm sure you probably get these in your email inbox a lot, or just in lots of different ways in the world of today. So asking people a variety of questions about themselves or about some product they bought or their attitudes about something, whatever it may be. Interviews and focus groups, another common one. So an interview might be one-on-one, asking some detailed questions about some experience, some attitude, right? Something that happened, whatever it may be. And focus groups, pretty much the same thing, except it's in a group context, right? So one example there from my experience, I was in a project looking at course evaluations. So the evals you students get at the end of each semester and fill out about instructors and the courses you take. We were doing a study on that, and we did focus groups where we met with instructors from around the institution, around the university, to hear how they used evaluation data in their own programs, right? So basically, what those scores were used for in terms of hiring, decision making, people getting raises, things like that. And so the broad term for these is self-report. And so what it sounds like, right? The self, the individual is reporting about themselves. So their own thoughts, feelings, experiences, and whatnot. So an example of a survey question from the Big Five, inventory a personality measure. You see these a lot in psychology. 1 to 5 might be 1 to 7, 1 to 10, whatever. Some kind of scale where they're disagreeing on one and then agreeing on the other. So you could pause and look here, examples of how you might see yourself or perceive your personality. But obviously interviews, another common thing there. Like, for example, I was on a project looking at pregnant women's use of cannabis when they were pregnant and their attitudes around it, because it was something we heard had been happening a lot, but we wanted to understand more about people's attitudes about it, their knowledge of the health of using cannabis while pregnant. And so we did in-depth interviews with a number of women to ask them about their experiences. Another example is observation. This could happen in a variety of contexts, but one example is if we're coding over behaviors. This is kind of a creepy looking image here, but I've been in studies kind of like this before. People knew we were there and we were actually in the room with them, but it was basically to evaluate people's leadership ability. And so we would be in a room and observe how they would participate in a group discussion, right? How they shared the space, how they interact with others, right? There was a variety of things we coded for. But one basic example there, yeah, really, I don't want to spend time going through a bunch of examples, but this could happen in a lot of contexts if we just need to basically count or code what people are doing. Another example is records. So we might look at archives or recorded information, might look at people's behaviors, their archived behaviors. So, for example, maybe web activity, what they're doing at work. I don't know. There's lots of different things you could really be doing here. People's social media content's another example, right? You can scrape Twitter and like analyze people's tweets, things like that. Very similar to that is case studies. So in this case, we're intensively examining one person or case. I have a picture of Freud here because he did some of that. Physiological measures, so for objectively measuring body functions. So for example, blood pressure, cortisol levels. Cortisol is a stress hormone that you can use tools to do a very quick saliva swab. So you just take a swab or a Q-tip and like scrape the inside of their mouth. And you can use that to assess people's cortisol levels, which is an objective way to measure essentially how stressed their body is by how much cortisol it's releasing. This is supposed to be a GIF, but it's not working. Pupillary response is another example. So it shows the pupil dilating, so opening and closing. Um, Another thing closely related to that is response performance studies, right? So how participants respond to stimuli, like maybe reaction time. But point being, there's a variety of ways we can collect data in social science. In psychology, I'd say the most common one we're using is typically questionnaires and surveys, but it could be a variety of things. But it's important to think about because the data we collect will obviously affect what analyses we can do. And we tend to kind of group those into qualitative and quantitative analyses. Oh, I forgot to animate this slide. But so to kind of help you distinguish those two, if you're not familiar with those, or if you could use a refresher. So let's say you just bought some bananas at the store. Good for you, you're eating healthy, and you have good taste, and your friend sees you come in from the grocery store, and they're immediately jealous of your bananas. Right? That's so typical of them. They're the jealous type. And so imagine they ask you a couple questions. Just think about how you would answer them. Right? So if they're like, "What's the quality of your bananas?" Right? It might be a weird question, but maybe it's one someone would ask. Well, if someone asked me the quality of the bananas, I'd probably say, "Oh, well, they look good. They're pretty yellow. They're not too green, so they seem kind of the right level of ripeness. They don't have a lot of brown spots. They don't seem bruised." You might open one up and eat it and say, "Oh yeah, they're fresh. They're delicious. They're like that perfect texture." Right? All these different things that are characteristics, qualities of the bananas that are all kind of subjective to you, right, based off your own perception. If they ask you what is the quantity of your bananas, you might scratch your head and wonder if they're doing okay, because that's a weird question, or it seems like a weirdly worded question. But you might say, "Oh, I don't know, I have 6 bananas," right? Something like that, or I have 0.75 pounds of bananas as rated on the scale at the store. Right. Point I'm getting at here is that if they ask you about the quality of your bananas, you're going to describe it in words, right, based off your perceptions, right? So the subjective use of words to describe something. The quantity then is a number, right? And that's kind of the key distinction between qualitative and quantitative research. And that qualitative research focuses on subjective information, often in narrative format, in other words, in words and text, right? So say I had like I did an interview for my study and I had a bunch of interview responses typed out, right? We can do data analysis and there's cool software to help us organize all that information, code it so that like specific quotes or pieces of it can kind of be organized or categorized together. And then we can run analyses using that. Quantitative research then is more number based, right? So focusing on quote unquote objective information in number format. And I put objective in quotes because it can still be subjective as long as it's in a number. So like this question, on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate your overall health? Right? So it's still a subjective self-rating, but we're asking them to put a number to it. So now we can do some different analyses that are more number-based. And so when we talk about statistics in this class, typically we're talking about quantitative research, but qualitative is still a very important part of social science and something that I wanted to mention here too. And I think it's just helpful to kind of get that distinction down early because you'll probably hear about it in a variety of classes that you take. Okay, next, let's talk about scales of measurement. Okay, scales of measurement. I think another way you can think of this maybe is units of measurement. And so there's a variety of different types here. I'll just start giving examples to hopefully explain this because I feel like if I try to explain what scales of measurement means, I'll just confuse you. So first we have nominal scale of measurement, or nominal to me, I tend to think of nominal and name. That's kind of like the little memory device that I use to help remember which one this is. So nominal, we're basically categorizing things, right? So we might measure things or use numbers to help us to basically just classify it, right, or organize it. So say, for example, I'm doing a study and I ask a basic question asking people's sex, right, and obviously I'm just conforming to the binary here for the sake of example, but 1 is male, 2 is female, right? We're just grouping things. There's no meaningful difference between a 1 and a 2 here. I could switch that and say 1 is female, 2 is male, and it really doesn't make much difference, right? It just affects how I interpret whatever the stats program kicks out. If I'm using a computer or a stats program to do this, But basically it's just a way to group things, right? And so each number basically represents like a bucket that we're putting things in. So like these are all the males, these are all the females, so on and so forth. Ordinal then, it's still categorized, but there's some rank system to it, right? So if I ask people their class rankings first through last, so if I, at the end of the semester, I made a ranking system of best student to worst student, sorry, right, that would be one example there, right? And that there's just like a clear ranking system, but the numbers don't reflect the extent to which people differed, right? Because maybe my best student and my second best student, maybe one of them had a 99% and one of them had a 97%, right? So there's only a 2% difference. And then I look at my worst student and the second worst. Maybe my worst student had a 2% in the course and my second worst had a 50% in the course, right? So now that's a 48% difference. Point being, the numbers and the difference between them just represents where they fall in the ranking, not the extent to which they differ on whatever it is we're ranking them on, right? Or another example there is if I asked you to rank your favorite teachers at UAF or your favorite restaurants in Fairbanks or wherever it is that you are, right? Those are some examples of things we might classify using an ordinal scale of measurement. Interval scales of measurement and ratio scales of measurement, these basically the same thing. So there's order and equal units, meaning that now, whereas in ordinal, the difference between numbers wasn't that meaningful, now the difference between numbers is meaningful, right? So like height, right? An inch is always an inch. If someone's 60 inches and 72 inches, or 100 inches and 112 inches, right? They're 12 inches apart in both those scenarios. The only difference here is if they have a absolute or true zero. Honestly, it's not really important for our purposes to know the difference here. So we'll just kind of, I tend to just lump these together in how I teach this class. I kind of think of this too as like continuous variables. And whereas these ones are categorical, right? We're kind of grouping things or categorizing them. Here it's just like we're measuring it with a ruler, basically. So just kind of briefly hitting on that. That's something we'll touch on throughout the semester. So if you're unsure of it now, let me know. But we'll continue to come back to it. Classification of variables, kind of just expanding on what we just talked about. Variables can be continuous or they can be discrete. Continuous means that they're measured along a continuum, so any place beyond the decimal point. So in other words, you can think of this as like a ruler, right? It could be an infinite ruler, or it could be much longer than a ruler that we typically use, but there's just a basic scale that we're using to measure people. So for example, in Olympics, sprinters time to finish a race, right? I guess this doesn't sound like a sprinter if it took them almost 4 minutes. But right, the basic example of a continuous measure, right? Discrete then is when we have categories, right? So there's separate and indivisible categories, and we're using whole numbers only, right? So now we can't have decimals. Here we had 3 minutes, 54 seconds. Here we just have 1, 2, and 3. If we're looking at, for example, socioeconomic class, right? Lower class, middle class, upper class, something like that. Or maybe race and ethnicity, right? If I'm just asking people their race or ethnicity and then I need some way to categorize them. And I guess I should say too, one of the reasons we're doing this and using numbers to describe these groups all is because that's what we'll need for our statistical analyses, right? Because again, we need numbers if we're doing these types of analyses. And even if we're just categorizing people, the numbers are still a helpful first step in preparing ourselves to do those analyses. Quantitative versus qualitative we just talked about. Once again, quantitative, think quantity, right, or numbers. Qualitative, think quality or letters, words, text, things like that. Okay, and this is an example from the textbook we're using in this course, the Privatera text. And so I won't spend a lot of time on this, but wanted to mention it here if you'd like some practice, kind of thinking through these different types of variables and if they're continuous and discrete, if they're qualitative or quantitative, the scale of measurement. This might be helpful to kind of think through some of that. So for example, if we look at political affiliation, for one example, Republican or Democrat, that's discrete, right? It's not continuous. We're just categorizing people, and we're categorizing them qualitatively here, right? We're saying you're a Republican or a Democrat, um, and that is nominal then, right? It's name, it's category, right? We're just kind of grouping them. Just one example, but I encourage you to spend some time with this. And with that, we'll go ahead and wrap up this video. We'll see you next time.